When people talk about World War II, they often talk about the battles in Europe, the Pacific, and the huge sacrifices made by soldiers from all over the United States. But there is another story inside that big story, a story about courage, determination, and fighting two major battles at the same time. One battle was against the enemies overseas, and the other was against racism at home. This is where the Tuskegee Airmen come in, and especially the men of the 99th Fighter Squadron, the first group of black fighter pilots in the U.S. military. The 99th Fighter Squadron began at a time when many Americans believed that black men were not brave enough, smart enough, or skilled enough to fly airplanes. It was a time when strong racial prejudice shaped almost every part of society. Many white commanders in the U.S. Army Air Forces did not want black pilots at all. Some argued that black men lacked the intelligence and discipline to handle complex aircraft or fight in the sky. These beliefs were not based on truth or science. They were based on deep racism and long-held stereotypes. In 1941, under pressure from civil rights activists, black leaders, and a few sympathetic politicians, the U.S. government finally approved a program to train black pilots. Tuskegee, Alabama, was chosen as the training location. It was not chosen because it was welcoming, but because it was in the segregated South where Jim Crow laws were strong and white officials believed it would keep the program separate from white trainees. The idea was basically, if we must train them, let them do it far away from the rest of the military. But what they intended as an isolated and limited experiment eventually became one of the most inspiring chapters in American military history. The men who signed up for the Tuskegee program understood they were stepping into a fight even before they reached the war. They faced racism from the moment they arrived. Many local white residents disliked the idea of black men becoming pilots. Some officers tried to make training difficult for them, believing they would fail and the program would be shut down. There were whispers that the whole project was meant to prove that black pilots could not succeed, so they could avoid integrating the military. Despite this hostile environment, the men trained with incredible focus. They studied navigation, engineering, aerodynamics, and the mechanics of flying. They spent long hours practicing on the ground and in the air. Every day was a challenge, not just because flying is difficult, but because they constantly had to prove their worth. A mistake that might be forgiven in a white trainee could be used as an excuse to shut down the whole program if a black trainee made it. The pressure was constant and heavy. The training at Tuskegee wasn't just about learning to fly. It was about breaking through walls that had been built by decades of discrimination. Many of the trainees were college students or graduates. Some already had private pilot licenses. They came from families and communities that believed strongly in education and discipline. They knew the world doubted them, but they also knew they had something to prove, not only for themselves, but for every black person in America who was told they were less than others. The instructors at Tuskegee included both black and white officers. Some white officers supported the program and wanted to help the men succeed. Others openly believed the trainees would fail and treated them harshly. But the trainees kept going. They knew that if they gave up, people would say, "See, we were right about them." So they pushed themselves harder than anyone expected. As the months went by, the pilots of the 99th Fighter Squadron earned their wings one by one. Each new pilot symbolized not only personal achievement, but a direct challenge to the racist beliefs held by many in the military. The squadron eventually deployed to North Africa and later to Italy and Sicily, where they began to fly real combat missions. Even before they entered combat, the 99th faced constant doubt. High-ranking officers questioned their abilities. Some commanders refused to believe reports that showed the squadron was performing well. They were treated as if their mistakes were bigger and their successes were smaller. Everything they did was watched closely and often unfairly. Still, the men did not let this stop them. They trained harder, flew longer, and studied every detail of their aircraft. They knew that once they reached the battlefield, they would have to prove themselves with actions, not words. Being part of the Tuskegee Airmen meant living under the weight of racism every single day. They lived on segregated bases. They faced racial insults, had limited access to certain facilities, and were often treated as second-class soldiers even though they wore the same uniform as everyone else. But despite all of this, they carried themselves with dignity and discipline. They were determined to show the world what they could do. Many of the men would later say that they were fighting two wars, the war against the Axis powers and the war against racism within their own country. And for many of them, the second war felt just as painful and difficult as the first. By the time the war was underway, the 99th Fighter Squadron had already faced more challenges than most military units did before even stepping into combat. But what they achieved despite these challenges changed the way the U.S. military and the American public viewed black service members. The story of the 99th Fighter Squadron is not just about airplanes or battles in the sky. It is also a story about determination, courage, and the refusal to accept limits placed on them because of the color of their skin. The Tuskegee Airmen became a symbol of what black Americans could achieve when given the chance, or when they fought to create that chance themselves. Their journey was difficult, unfair, and exhausting, but they kept going. And because they kept going, they changed history. By the summer of 1943, the war in Europe had reached a critical point. The Allies were pushing into southern Europe, and Sicily became one of the main battlegrounds. The skies over the island were crowded with bombers, transport planes, and fighter aircraft from both sides. It was a dangerous place, filled with smoke, anti-aircraft guns, and enemy fighters waiting to strike. Into this intense environment came a 99th Fighter Squadron, flying their P-40 Warhawk fighters on escort missions. On July 2, 1943, the morning began like many other mission days for the Tuskegee Airmen. The sun was just rising, stretching light over the rugged Sicilian landscape. Pilots prepared their aircraft, checking fuel levels, ammunition, and radios. Mechanics moved between planes, tightening bolts, wiping down oil leaks, and making sure everything was ready. These missions were serious. A mistake in the air could cost many lives. Lieutenant Charles B. Hall, a 22-year-old pilot from Brazil, Indiana, was one of the men preparing for the day's mission. Hall was known for being calm, focused, and disciplined. He didn't talk too much about himself. Many who served with him described him as quiet but determined, someone who spoke more through his actions than through words. He had worked hard through training and had built a reputation as a reliable pilot. On this particular day, Hall and the 99th were assigned to escort a group of American B-25 Mitchell bombers on their mission over Sicily. Escorting bombers was dangerous work, but it was extremely important. The bombers flew slower and were easy targets for enemy fighters, so the escort fighters had to stay alert at all times. Their job was to detect enemy aircraft first, move to intercept them, and stop them from reaching the bombers. As the planes lifted off the runway, the air quickly filled with the roar of engines. The fighters climbed into formation around the bombers. The sky was clear, but the pilots knew that could change at any moment. Enemy fighters often attacked from above or from the sun, where they could not be easily spotted. For a while, the flight was calm. The pilots scanned the skies constantly, their eyes moving across the horizon, the clouds, and the sun's glare. The tension was always there. They knew the German Luftwaffe was skilled and experienced. The Fw-190, one of Germany's main fighter planes, was fast, heavily armed, and deadly in the hands of a good pilot. As the formation approached Sicily, things changed quickly. Hall spotted movement, two dark shapes diving from above, approaching fast. His training kicked in immediately. These were German Fw-190 fighters, coming in at high speed and aiming straight for the American bombers. Hall had only a moment to act. He called out the sighting, pulled his P-40 into position, and prepared to engage. His heartbeat probably quickened, but his actions were steady. He pushed the throttle forward, feeling the engine surge. The German fighters were already firing, trying to break up the bomber formation. Hall maneuvered his aircraft into an attack angle. The P-40 wasn't the most advanced fighter in the war, but it was tough and handled well in a dive. Hall aimed carefully. This was no time for panic. He lined up his guns with the enemy fighter and pressed the trigger. The P-40's machine guns roared, sending streams of bullets toward the Fw-190. At first, it wasn't clear if the shots had hit. Combat in the air happens so fast that seconds feel like minutes. But then Hall saw pieces break off the German fighter. Smoke trailed from its engine. The enemy aircraft wobbled, losing control. Hall stayed on it, firing again to make sure. Within moments, the Fw-190 spiraled downward, disappearing into the Sicilian countryside below. That was it. Hall had just shot down an enemy fighter in real combat. And not just any fighter, but one of the Luftwaffe's most feared aircraft. It was the kind of moment pilots trained for, but knew might never come. For Hall, it was a combination of skill, courage, preparation, and instinct. The second German fighter, seeing its partner fall, broke off and retreated. The threat had passed, at least for the moment. The bombers continued their mission, protected by the quick action of Hall and the other Tuskegee pilots. In the air, there was no time for celebration. The mission wasn't over yet. The pilots had to keep escorting the bombers, maintain formation, and prepare for any new threats. But inside his cockpit, Hall must have felt something powerful, a mixture of relief, adrenaline, and pride. He had done what many people believed a black pilot could never do. He had engaged a skilled German fighter and won. When the squadron finally returned to base and landed, word spread quickly about what Hall had done. Mechanics, officers, and fellow pilots gathered around as he climbed out of his plane. Some patted his back. Some shook his hand. Others simply stared, knowing they had witnessed history. This was the first time an African-American pilot in the U.S. military had achieved a confirmed aerial victory. It wasn't just a personal achievement for Hall. It was a victory for every man in the squadron, for the Tuskegee program, and for black Americans who had long been told they were not capable of excellence in the air. Hall's kill proved that the doubts, insults, and barriers they had faced meant nothing compared to their skill and determination. Back in the United States, newspapers in the black community quickly began reporting the news. The Chicago Defender, Pittsburgh Courier, and other major black publications celebrated Hall's achievement as a breakthrough moment. Entire communities felt pride because they saw themselves in the success of the Tuskegee pilots. But even with this victory, Hall and the 99th knew their work wasn't done. Racism in the military didn't disappear overnight. Some officers tried to downplay the squadron's accomplishments. Others acted like Hall's victory was a lucky moment rather than proof of ability. Still, the men of the 99th pushed forward. They kept flying missions, protecting bombers, and proving their worth again and again. That day over Sicily, however, changed everything. It was a moment that could not be ignored. Hall had shown that when a man is given the chance to fly, his performance is determined by his skill and courage, not by the color of his skin. July 2nd, 1943, became a date remembered in military history. It was the day the first African-American fighter pilot shot down an enemy aircraft. It was the day Charles B. Hall left his mark on the war. And it was the day the Tuskegee Airmen took a major step toward proving that they belonged in the skies just as much as anyone else. Lieutenant Charles B. Hall's victory on July 2nd, 1943, was more than just another moment in the long, brutal timeline of World War II. It was a quiet but powerful turning point in American military history, a moment that began to break down beliefs that had existed for generations. Hall's achievement wasn't just about shooting down an enemy plane. It challenged racism directly, proved long-standing stereotypes wrong, and showed the entire country what black pilots were capable of when given the chance. When Hall's plane landed after that mission, and the news spread through the base, the men of the 99th Fighter Squadron felt something deeper than excitement. They felt validation. They felt a sense of victory not only over an enemy fighter, but also over the doubts and insults they had faced back home. These pilots had come into the war carrying the weight of prejudice. They had been told, directly or indirectly, that they weren't smart enough, fast enough, or brave enough to fly combat missions. Every day in training had been a test, and even after earning their wings, some officers still doubted them. Hall's victory cut through all of that. It was stamped into the record books. It couldn't be denied or excused away. A black pilot had outfought and outflown a German Luftwaffe fighter, one of the most feared aviation forces of the time. That fact alone had power. Word of Hall's accomplishment traveled fast, especially in the black community. Newspapers like the Chicago Defender, Pittsburgh Courier, and Baltimore Afro-American published bold headlines and wrote excited articles celebrating him. To these newspapers, Hall wasn't just a pilot. He was a symbol of hope and achievement. He represented the possibility that black Americans could break through barriers that had held them back for so long. People in black communities across the United States clipped out the articles, hung them on walls, and shared them with friends and neighbors. Parents who had been told their children would never be treated as equals found comfort in seeing Hall's success. Young boys and girls read about him and suddenly realized they could dream bigger. Maybe they too could fly one day, or join the military, or become leaders in places where society had said they didn't belong. Hall's victory mattered because it touched emotions far beyond the battlefield. But the significance of that moment wasn't only in how black America responded. The U.S. military itself also had to take notice. Before Hall's victory, many high-ranking officers doubted the 99th Fighter Squadron. Some didn't want them in combat at all. Others believed the program at Tuskegee was a mistake and hoped it would fail. Hall's victory made that argument much harder to defend. The military couldn't ignore the fact that a black pilot had successfully shot down an enemy aircraft in real combat. Not practice combat, not training, but in the actual heat of battle against a skilled enemy. This forced commanders to look at the Tuskegee program differently. Some still held on to their bias, but the evidence was there, and it would only grow stronger as the war continued. Hall's kill didn't immediately erase racism in the military. Far from it. The Tuskegee Airmen would continue to face discrimination and unfair treatment. But his victory cracked open a door that had been shut for years. It planted doubts in the minds of those who insisted black pilots weren't capable. It made others question what else the Tuskegee Airmen might achieve. And perhaps even more importantly, it boosted the confidence of the pilots themselves. When you're constantly pressured to prove you belong, even a moment of success can give you strength. Hall's achievement reminded the men of the 99th that they weren't just fighting to survive the war. They were fighting to change history. The pilots felt that they could walk with their heads held a little higher. They had something concrete to show for their effort, something undeniable. Hall's kill meant that all their hard training, all the long nights studying navigation and aerodynamics, all the insults and doubters they had endured, it was all worth it. They had not only matched their white counterparts, they had exceeded expectations in a moment of real danger. Another layer of significance came from outside the black community and the military. When the news reached the wider American public, even people who weren't particularly supportive of racial equality had to recognize what happened. They may not have openly changed their hearts, but many quietly changed their opinions. Seeing a black pilot succeed in combat shook their assumptions. It made them realize that skill and bravery had nothing to do with skin color. Hall's victory also helped shift the conversation about the war itself. Black Americans were fighting and dying for a country that didn't fully treat them as equals. But now the country had to face the truth. These men weren't just participants in the war, they were heroes in it. Their contributions mattered, and their successes couldn't be ignored. This created pressure in political circles, too. Lawmakers and military leaders were forced to confront the contradiction of sending black men to fight for freedom abroad while denying them freedom at home. Hall's victory became one of the many pieces of evidence that eventually pushed the United States to desegregate its armed forces in 1948. For the Tuskegee pilots themselves, Hall's kill became a source of motivation. It set a standard they wanted to reach and surpass. It also strengthened the squadron's unity. They realized they weren't just individuals fighting their own battles. They were part of a team proving something much bigger. When new pilots joined the squadron later in the war, they heard about Hall's achievement. It became part of the squadron's identity. It shaped their pride, their confidence, and their sense of purpose. Hall's victory became a reminder that every mission they flew had meaning beyond the immediate goal. Every time they took off, they weren't just fighting enemy pilots. They were fighting old beliefs, outdated ideas, and the walls of segregation. Hall himself didn't boast about his victory. He stayed the same quiet, humble man he had always been. But that only made the moment more powerful. He wasn't a show-off trying to get attention. He was a skilled pilot doing his job, and his achievement spoke for itself. Over time, historians would come to describe Hall's kill as one of the most symbolic victories of the war. Not because it changed the battle in Sicily, but because it changed something much deeper, people's minds. It gave evidence that black excellence, bravery, and intelligence were never the problem. Opportunity was. Hall's victory stands as a reminder that sometimes the most important battles are not the biggest ones, and the most powerful victories are not the loudest. A single moment, a single confirmed kill, can carry meaning that reaches far beyond the battlefield. That is why Hall's victory truly mattered. The legacy of the Tuskegee Airmen is one of the most powerful and lasting stories to come out of World War II. Their journey was filled with obstacles, unfair treatment, and constant prejudice, yet they rose above everything that stood in their way. They did not just fly planes. They broke barriers, challenged deeply rooted racism, and changed the future of the U.S. military. What they accomplished continues to inspire new generations, long after the war has ended. When the Tuskegee Airmen entered the war, almost nobody in the military expected them to succeed. Many officers hoped they would fail so that the door to black military aviation could be shut forever. But the airmen refused to let discrimination determine their future. Instead, they focused on their training, their discipline, and their goal, to prove they were just as capable as any other pilot. As the war went on, their performance spoke louder than anyone's doubts. The 99th Fighter Squadron, and later the 332nd Fighter Group, flew mission after mission, often in dangerous conditions. They provided fighter escort for bombers, attacked enemy targets on the ground, and defended Allied forces across North Africa, Italy, and Germany. They developed a reputation for sticking closely to the bombers they protected, earning respect from the crews who depended on them. Their combat record grew stronger with each mission. They destroyed enemy aircraft, damaged supply lines, disrupted enemy movements, and successfully protected American bombers in some of the toughest parts of the war. In total, the Tuskegee Airmen flew thousands of missions. They earned hundreds of medals and commendations. They showed incredible bravery and skill, even when they were not treated fairly by the very country they were fighting for. But the legacy of the Tuskegee Airmen is not just about numbers or military statistics. It is about the meaning behind what they achieved. Every time they took off and returned successfully, they were proving something bigger, that segregation and racist beliefs about black soldiers were completely wrong. One of the most influential parts of their legacy comes from how they changed the opinions of people who once doubted them. At first, many commanders did not want black pilots in combat. But after seeing their performance, things began to shift. The more missions they flew, the more respect they earned. It became harder and harder for anyone to argue that black pilots lacked skill or bravery. The Tuskegee Airmen showed that ability has nothing to do with skin color, something the military had refused to accept for years. By the end of the war, the success of the Tuskegee Airmen had become impossible to ignore. Their strong combat record, their professionalism, and their determination showed the military and the country that segregation made no sense. They did everything that had been said they could not do. They flew dangerous missions. They protected bombers. They outmaneuvered skilled enemy pilots. They served with honor and courage. This, in turn, helped create pressure for change. After the war ended, people began asking why black soldiers, who had fought and died for freedom, were still being denied full equality in the military and at home. The Tuskegee Airmen's achievements became part of a larger argument for justice. Their service helped open the door to one of the most important decisions in U.S. military history, the desegregation of the armed forces. In 1948, President Harry S. Truman issued Executive Order 9981, which officially ended racial segregation in the U.S. military. This decision did not happen overnight, nor was it caused by one single event. But the Tuskegee Airmen played a major role in proving that segregation was unfair, illogical, and harmful to the country. Their performance during the war gave leaders like Truman the evidence they needed to push for change. The Tuskegee Airmen's legacy also includes the personal stories of the men themselves, stories of perseverance, courage, and dignity. Many of them returned home after the war to a country that still treated black people unfairly. Even after risking their lives, some were denied the respect they deserved. But they continued to live with pride and strength. Some became educators, doctors, engineers, and community leaders. Others remained in the military and helped shape the new, integrated armed forces. Lieutenant Charles B. Hall, whose victory in 1943 became one of the most symbolic moments in their history, also carried a legacy that reached far beyond the battlefield. His aerial victory was not just a single success. It was the beginning of a wave of recognition. It showed young black Americans that they could achieve anything when given a fair chance. It reminded people that heroism comes from character, not skin color. Hall's victory became a point of pride for the Tuskegee Airmen and the black community. It was a story parents told their children. It was a story that made young people believe they could break barriers in their own lives, whether in the military, in education, or in any career they pursued. His moment in the sky over Sicily became part of the foundation that helped reshape American society. Today, the legacy of the Tuskegee Airmen continues to grow. Schools teach their story. Books, documentaries, and museums honor their achievements. Their red-tailed fighter planes have become symbols of courage and excellence. Many modern pilots, including black men and women who fly for the Air Force, commercial airlines, or space programs, say they were inspired by the Tuskegee Airmen. Without the airmen breaking those barriers, countless opportunities in aviation might still be closed today. The U.S. military also honors them. Bases, aircraft, monuments, and scholarships bear their name. The pilots who once had to fight for the right to even train are now remembered as heroes who helped change the course of history. But maybe the greatest part of their legacy is the lesson they left behind, that determination and dignity can overcome even the strongest prejudice. They prove that courage does not look at race. Excellence does not depend on color. An opportunity should never be limited by someone else's ignorance. The Tuskegee Airmen did not ask for their struggle, but they carried it bravely. They fought for their country, while their country still struggled to accept them. They soared through skies filled with danger and into history with every mission. Their legacy is one of inspiration, justice, and the belief that barriers can be broken, not just in the air, but anywhere. And at the heart of that legacy remains moments like Charles B. Hall's first victory, a reminder of the day a young pilot proved to the world that black excellence could never be ignored again.